Here's another quilt-as-you-go project, barn quilts. Barn quilts are really common in our area, and it's fun to make blocks that resemble the barn quilts. I've got a variety. I have some brightly colored ones with a black and white theme, and I've got those solid ones, and I'm going to put the solids on the back. Here's how I do it. Well, here is my bucket of batting scraps. Sometimes my friendly long armers cut off the edges and donate them to me. A lot of these are maybe 10 inches, 9 inches, something like that wide, and the length of a quilt. So when I get a lot of them, I can either make placemats or I can do a quilt-as-you-go project. And this time I'm going to do a quilt-as-you-go project. This bunch of squares over here are going to be on the front of the quilt. They're a bit modern and fun with a very nice black and white border around them. And what I'm going to do on the back are the more traditional barn blocks. So I have 6 completed blocks and some solid fabric to fill in the rest of the spaces. So I've already tested my theory out on this purple and pink square up at the top. And on the back is one of the traditional barn blocks, already quilted. So when I make a quilt-as-you-go, I have the front of the quilt, I have the back of the quilt, I have the squares in basically the same size, and I have a lot of batting scraps. So the first thing I do is change my cutting board. Whenever you cut batting, it leaves a really big mess on the surface. So my old cutting board, which has a few dings and bends in it, is designated to cut batting. Whenever I'm making anything with batting, I use this cutting board. So the first thing I like to do is I take those strips and I cut them to the approximate length of the squares that I'm going to make. And then I start to join them up. Now, how do I join them up? Good question. Okay, so the first thing I do, you notice they're not even all the way up and down. But I want to join these together. So the best way to do that, is to overlap them. Overlap the pieces. And then using a straight edge, cut through both pieces so that you have a uniform piece. If you don't do that, you have an extra layer of batting at the center of the block, which will create a bump in the finished quilt. So I take off the top piece that I cut, lift this out of the way, and then I take out the bottom piece. And when I put this back down on top, they meet perfectly. So the second thing I need to do is I have some iron-on interfacing, very lightweight. It irons on, and I just lay that down the center of the 2 pieces, making sure that they butt up together. And then I take this over to my ironing board rack Actually, I do that on my ironing board, and I just give it an iron on this side that joins the two pieces together. Then I can cut this piece of batting to the size of my blocks. Works well. It uses up a lot of these batting pieces, and by the time I finish making this quilt, which has 12 blocks, there will be a bit of a dent in my batting scraps. So that's my plan for the next couple of days. Join these batting pieces up and quilt the pieces. I'll show you how I do that. So on my sewing machine, I have a free motion foot, and my seam stitch length is at a 3.0. That gives me enough flexibility for maneuvering this little piece of quilt around under the presser foot. And I really like quilt-as-you-go styles because you can learn a lot about free motion stitching in a small piece. And if it goes terribly wrong, then you only have a small piece to pick the stitches out of instead of a whole great huge quilt, which is very sad when that happens. So the bottom thread I picked, because the backings of the quilt are going to be white and dark blue and red and green, I picked a somewhat gray color of thread for the bobbin. And I'm going to just do a meandering stitch on the sewing machine here, which means that I can hold it and just move my quilt piece, which is only 19 inches, 18 and a half inches. I can move this around to cover the surface. So when I start, I make sure that there's thread in the bobbin, because there's nothing worse than getting to the middle of the quilt and finding there's nothing on the bobbin, or the bobbin is almost empty. That's so sad, because you're in the middle and then you have to stop, thread the bobbin, and pull those stitches through and knot them, get them all out of the way. With Quilt-as-you-go, you can start at the side and end at a side, and you don't have to worry about all of that stuff with Quilt-as-you-go. It's just my favorite thing to do. So normally I would put a few safety pins in, mainly at the corners, but it's not that big, so it's not going to buckle very much. And it's certainly easy to do. So I start at the side, any side, it doesn't matter. I'm going to meander, and that means I'm just going to wander around without really crossing my stitches anywhere. And it will cover this in a few minutes. So start at the side. Quite often I will wear some gloves, but because this is such a small piece, it's not hard to hold and it's not hard to move around. So I go in a diagonal to the pattern, and then I turn a 45 degree and come out that way and do a couple of loops that way. Fill it in a bit. You just want to do it slowly. Let the machine do the work, pulling it through. You want to stop, make sure you stop in one spot, and you can twist your fabric around so you can see what you've done and how far it's gone. And on the back, I'll show you in a few minutes and see how it looks. I'd take out another pin. I put 6 or 7 pins in here. But you want a nice, smooth, consistent flow of the sewing machine. No jerking around and no big loops and wheelies. If you don't like meandering, you can always do around the edges of the motif that you've put on, or you can do straight line stitching. Anything that you think is going to make your quilting design look good is what you should do. Coming up to 1/4, another pin. I've got to take the pin out. Gives me a good chance to turn the fabric a bit. I find a good light coming from the front makes it a lot easier to see the stitches, especially since it's a white fabric background and a white thread. Believe it or not, I find this kind of relaxing. And this is real-time sewing. I usually have music going in the background. It's not quiet. I don't really listen to the sewing machine. But I really find this relaxing to just meander and sew. I like it a lot. Take a pin out. Turn it around. My silly machine. This started acting up. Okay. Another pin. I'm almost done. Just have to come down here. Sometimes I find all these threads from sewing the blocks together, but I just pull it. They're usually seam allowances. Sometimes they're not. off the side. So it's hard to see sometimes on the front, but when you turn to the back, if it's a solid fabric, I don't know if you can see that, but it's pretty consistent. But it's pretty consistent all the way around. There's a few jerky spots. The stitches are evenly formed all over the surface. So now I just bring it back to the cutting table, and I can trim off the extra little bit from the bottom and make it squared up again. There's always a little bit of extra batting or extra bottom that I need to trim up. And I will use the cutting board itself as a measuring tool and square up my lines once again. And so it goes. It's easy to do, it's kind of fun. Free motion stitching, quilt as you go. I find it really fast and economical. There, block 2, quilted. I'm going to sew these 3 big squares together with a quilt as you go method. And I will review that here now. On the back, which are solid colors, and remember these are all quilted already. So on the back, which are more primary colors, I'm going to use blue strips. I have a bunch of random blue color strips. And this backing strip is 1 1/2 inches wide. And that's just going to lie underneath with the edge matching the edge of one of the blocks. Now on the top, I'm going to use something that's black and white. And I have taken random pieces of black and white fabric that is 2 inches wide. And what I will do is fold it in half. Fold it in half, and the raw edge will go on the edge of the block. So on the top I have a 2-inch strip folded in half, and on the bottom I have a 1 1/2 inch strip, and it is not folded. So what I will do is just sew those layers together, and that's step 1. Okay, now to turn around and go and stitch this. I often use the presser foot as a means of holding those things together before I start sewing, and I can adjust it. So I just make sure that all of the edges are aligned. And so my seam It might be easier if you pressed the 2-inch strip in half before attempting to sew it, but I find I can do it without pressing. Step 1 done. I just trim that off a bit longer. Now, step 2. This is going to go there. Okay, so these are going to go like that. So the first thing I need to do is to sew the back together. And I make sure that this is going to go back to back, like that, back to back on the back side. And that's on the right side, correct. So in order to do this, I usually turn it upside down so I can see what I'm sewing on the back side. And I make sure that the bottom of the two pieces of quilt square are aligned, and the edge of this piece of blue backing strip is where I want it as well, on the edge. And now I just stitch along this seam, top to bottom. When I get closer to the top, I make sure that the 2 top areas are aligned as well. If you've done your trimming properly, it works out fine. If you don't trim, you might not have evenness at the ends of your stitching rows. Okay, now it's time to check that. Okay, so here on the back side, I always check along the stitching line on both sides to make sure all of those raw edges are caught into the seam allowance that I just sewed. That looks good. If there's any loose threads at this time, I tend to tie them off or cut them off, one or the other. All right. Then this gets turned over. I usually just roll this edge up a bit so it's out of my way. But you can see here, up here, you can see here how the seam allowance is meeting the seam allowance on both sides. I mean, I can pull it apart. You can see the blue through there, but I don't want to pull it. I want it just to lie normal. And then this is going to fold over, and because it's a folded edge, I don't have to worry about trying to tuck something underneath. And some people like to do this with hand sewing. I like to do it with machine sewing. You just don't want to pull. Just keep those seam allowances and press this over with your fingers as you go. So everything's nice and smooth. Just like that. Done. Take it out and check your stitching on the back side to make sure it's acceptable to you. Generally, the stitching on the back side lies just on the edge. Sometimes I will make another row of stitching on this side over here just to make it look uniform. And if that's something you like to do, that's something you should do. Now on to the next one. Make sure my piece of blue is long enough to go from one end to the other, which it is. There, next one set up. Once you get it all started, it goes pretty fast. This one next. It's going to go here. That folds down. I find I talk to myself quite a bit when I'm sewing. I think I just need a second opinion, but I find that I talk to myself quite a bit. Just before I sew it closed, I check to make sure the seam allowances are caught in on the back. Both sides. None of the batting shows out. Excellent. Let's roll this up a bit. Roll this one over. And sew it down. Well, if you've watched this far, thank you very much. Real-time sewing can be kind of like watching paint dry, but if you find this video interesting, please give me a thumbs up or make a comment in the comment section. I have fun making my quilts. I hope you enjoy making something as a result of what I've shown you here. And have fun. Check the front, check the back. Stitching is nice and uniform. So the top 2 rows are quilted and sewn together. The bottom 2 rows just need to be done, but that will be done soon. Have a good time.